A theme of our recent discussions has been the way that the ancient Romans, continue to influence us today. And we're going to look at a way that the Romans still influence people living in the United States, because there's some ancient Roman influence in the U.S. Constitution. And so we'll look at that. Let's start with a definition of power, because we're going to be saying a little bit about political power today. And that word political comes to us from the Greek word polis, which means city. And so political power has to do with the power that comes with governing, the power that a person needs in order to govern a city, a state, a nation. Basic definition of power is the capacity that A has to influence the behavior of B, so that B acts in accordance with A's wishes. Translation: power is the ability to get other people to do what you want them to do. And it could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing, it could be through persuasion, it could be through force. But this is the most basic definition of power: the ability to get people to do what you want them to do. Could be good, could be bad, depends on the situation. Now Plato, his idea was that if somebody wants power, then that's probably a sign that the person should not have power, right? Plato's idea, remember our discussion of the philosopher king, that the people who rule, the philosopher kings, these are the people who have demonstrated that they are people of great wisdom, that they are people of great virtue. And these are the people who should have power, because they'll use that power in the right way. They'll use that power not to further empower themselves and their friends, but they will use the power they have for the good of the state, for the good of the city, for the good of the country. And so if you are ambitious for power because you want power, right? For Plato, that's a sign you probably shouldn't have it. One of the reasons, I think, when we think about, Plato's caution, if somebody wants power, that's probably a sign they shouldn't have it. I think one of the things that's going on is there's a recognition that power does tend to corrupt people. Right? Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Right? And I think the actual quote from Lord Acton, who was a man in England, I think the actual line is that power tends to corrupt. So it's not that power definitely will corrupt a person. There are people with power in the world of business, in the world of government. There are people who have power who don't become corrupt. But the idea is that power tends to corrupt, and that absolute power can corrupt absolutely. Right? It's the rare person who can have tremendous power and not be corrupted by it. So let's turn our attention now to the U.S. Constitution. The founders of this country understood this principle, that power tends to corrupt, and that absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely, right? Now, at the same time, if you're going to have a country, there have to be people with power. Then there have to be some people with a lot of power. So how do we work this out? Power tends to corrupt, but we also need people with a lot of power. So what should we do? And the founders of this country decided that let's have different parts of the government, different branches of government that will have different powers. And so we'll have a president, we'll have a legislative branch, we'll have a judiciary. These are the three branches of the U.S. government. The legislative branch, this is the United States House of Representatives and the Senate. They write and pass laws. Then you have the executive branch, that's the president. And then you have the judicial branch, the federal judges, right? Now, a president has a lot of power. The president, in the early 21st century, the U.S. president is probably the single most powerful human being on the planet. That's a lot of power. And yet, within the American political system, the power of the president is checked by other powers within the government. The legislative branch has power over the president. The president can say, I want such and such thing to be done. And the legislature can say, no. Or the president and the legislature together the legislature can pass a law, the president can agree and sign the law, and then the judicial branch can say, no, right? It's not constitutional. this is what the writers of the U.S. Constitution had in mind. Of course, to manage a country, we need people who have a lot of power. But we want to prevent that power from getting concentrated in too few hands. The individual most responsible for the U.S. Constitution, a lot of people are involved in the writing of the U.S. Constitution, but the individual most responsible for the U.S. Constitution is James Madison of Virginia. And here's what he said, that the accumulation of all powers, legislative, that is writing laws, executive, that is the president, executing the laws, making sure that the laws are carried out, and the judiciary, the accumulation of all these powers in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. Translation, James Madison is saying, we do not want the concentration of these different powers, that is the power to make law, the power to make sure that the laws are enforced, and the power to determine whether the laws are constitutional. That's what judges do. The power to have all of those powers concentrated in one place. That is the very definition of tyranny. And so we need to prevent that from happening. We need to separate powers. We need to divide these powers, right, to work against tyranny. Now, Madison was very much influenced by a Frenchman, Charles de Montesquieu, right, who said this: when the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person, so he doesn't mention the judiciary in this quote, but the lawmaking part of government, the legislative, and the executive, that would be the president, when these are in the same person, or in the same body of magistrates, that is, in the same group of people, there can be no liberty. Because apprehensions may arise lest the same monarch or senate should enact tyrannical laws to execute them in a tyrannical manner. Okay? Basically the same thing Madison is saying. If we have too much power concentrated in the hands of one person or in the hands of a relatively small group of people, then we are on the road to tyranny. Okay? So Montesquieu was a very big influence on the writers of the U.S. Constitution, very big influence when it comes to this topic of separation of powers. Now, where did Montesquieu get his ideas? Well, one of the places he got his ideas was from his study of ancient Rome. And here's a book he wrote, and the title there is in French, but basically it says Considerations Concerning the Greatness and the Decadence of Rome. So what made Rome great, and what made Rome, not great? What caused Rome to decline and fall? And so Montesquieu studies Rome, and he takes some lessons from what he learned about Rome. And the writers of the U.S. Constitution did the same. The writers of the U.S. Constitution studied Greek history, they studied Roman history, they studied many, many different constitutions. They wanted to put together a constitution that will actually work. And so one of the things the writers of the U.S. Constitution did was they listened to what other people were saying, like Montesquieu, and they read Montesquieu's books and got what he was saying. And they also studied history for themselves. Here's what John Adams says. John Adams is one of these key founders of the United States. The Roman Constitution formed the noblest people and the greatest power that has ever existed. Okay. Now, as we'll see in a future discussion, there's plenty to critique in ancient Rome. All right, there's plenty that's unattractive, and by the standards of the early 21st century, pretty awful. Okay, but if we think about the world as it was at that time, the Constitution of the Roman Republic, the Pax Romana, which we've discussed, pretty impressive by the standards of the day. Now look at what John Adams goes on to say. If all the powers of the consuls, that is the Roman consuls, the Senate, and the people, had been centered in a single assembly of the people collectively or representatively, will any man pretend to believe that they would have been long free or ever great? In other words, this translation, basic idea, same thing Madison says, same thing Montesquieu says, same thing Lord Acton suggests. John Adams says that he looks at the Constitution of the Roman Republic and thinks that's pretty impressive, pretty impressive, the system they put together. But John Adams says, what if they had allowed the different powers that the consuls had, the Senate had, the people had, What if they allowed all those powers to become concentrated in one person or in one group of people? Then forget it. They would have lost their freedom. Same theme, right? The concentration of power leads to tyranny. And so we need to separate power. We need to divide power. So let's go back and look at a little bit of the Constitution of the Roman Republic. And John Adams knew the work of Polybius, this Roman historian. James Madison certainly knew the work of Polybius. Montesquieu knew the work of Polybius. And Polybius tells us a little bit about the Constitution of the Roman Republic. So remember the idea of separation of powers, right? So here's what Polybius says. As for the Roman Constitution, it had 3 elements. So in the American constitutional system, we have 3 branches of government. The legislative, that is the Congress, made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate. And then that's one branch, so the legislative branch. And then there's the executive branch, that's the president. And then there's the judiciary. So there are 3 branches of government. Look at what Polybius says. As for the Roman Constitution, it had 3 elements. So the Roman Constitution has 3 branches, we could say. Now, one of the things that Polybius says, he refers to the consuls, right? And so he says, for example, the consuls are supreme masters of administration. Now, just down below, just who are the consuls? So consuls are elected each year by a popular assembly after being nominated by the Roman Senate. So here's something that we see in the Constitution of the Roman Republic. The Roman Senate will nominate consuls, and then it's a popular assembly that actually will select, right? So the Roman Senate nominates, and the popular assembly actually votes on whether those nominations go through. So the Roman Senate has power to nominate, but the Roman Senate doesn't have the power to make it so. If it's going to be so, that's the popular assembly. You see, there are different powers, and for this to work, each of these powers, the Senate and the popular assembly, each of these powers have to agree. There's a principle here. One power nominates, and the other either accepts or rejects the nomination. We see that at work in the U.S. Constitution. So, for example, if you look below, when it comes to, for example, ambassadors, right? Here's what the U.S. Constitution says: that the President shall nominate, and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate shall appoint ambassadors. In other words, the President can nominate an ambassador, say the American ambassador to South Korea, the American ambassador to Turkey, the American ambassador to Costa Rica. The President can say, here's the person I want as the American ambassador to Mexico. But it doesn't happen unless the Senate agrees. That's that line about advice and consent. So we see a principle in the Constitution of the Roman Republic. One body nominates, another body says either yes or no. We see this principle at work in the U.S. Constitution as well. The U.S. President nominates, and the Senate says either yes or no. That's separation of powers. That's an example of separation of powers. Polybius wrote that the consuls are supreme masters of the administration. The consuls see to the execution of the decrees of the Senate. Okay? So the Senate puts in place certain decrees. This shall happen. And the job of the consul is to make sure that it happens. The consul is the supreme master of administration, right? Well, let's look at what the U.S. Constitution says. The executive power shall be vested in a president. A president by himself cannot pass laws, right? A president by himself cannot say, I think taxes should go down from, this such and such tax should go down from 20% to 16%, and thus it shall be. The president can't do that. The president can ask Congress to do it, but if Congress doesn't do it, it doesn't happen, right? Now, if suppose Congress passes a law, right? And of course, Congress does this all the time. Congress passes a law. The president's job is to execute the law, to make sure that the law is carried out. Just like Polybius says, that the job of the consul is to see to the execution of the Senate's decrees. The president's job is to see to the execution of the laws that Congress passes. Okay, so let's look at this. It says that the consuls have the power to introduce foreign ambassadors to the Senate and to bring matters requiring deliberation before the Senate. Okay, so the consuls in the Roman Republic introduce foreign ambassadors, and they bring matters to the Senate for deliberation, that is, for the Senate to consider. Look at what the U.S. Constitution says. The President shall nominate, and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate shall appoint ambassadors. Okay, so it's a similar idea. The President says, or the consul says, here's an ambassador that I'm introducing to the Senate. The President introduces his nomination of the ambassador to the Senate. The Senate, the President is saying, I want your advice and consent. Is this ambassador okay with you? Look at what Polybius says, that the consul brings to the Senate matters requiring deliberation. In other words, the consul brings to the Senate matters looking for their advice and consent. So I think when we look at this Constitution from the Roman Republic, we look at the U.S. Constitution, we can see separation of powers. Again, the President can nominate an ambassador but cannot make it so. Only the Senate can make it so. We see something like that in the Roman Republic. We see something like that in the U.S. Constitution. Here's something else. The consuls, in preparations for war also, and in a word, in the entire administration of a campaign, they have all but absolute power. So when it comes to the prosecution of war, right, then the consuls have tremendous power. Look at what the U.S. Constitution says. The President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. The President is the Commander-in-Chief, right, of the military. And when the country's at war, the person ultimately in command of the military is the U.S. President, just as Polybius says the consuls. They had ultimate power when the Roman Republic is at war, so the U.S. President has ultimate power when the U.S. military is at war. And just as an example, the photo there is President Truman and General MacArthur. And during the war in Korea in the early 1950s, President Truman and General MacArthur had a disagreement, and President Truman won because he's Commander-in-Chief. And it didn't matter that General MacArthur had a bunch of stars on his collar indicating his tremendous power, and General MacArthur had a lot of power. But the President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief. And so when they had a disagreement, the President wins. So there's an example of how the President is Commander-in-Chief, or as Polybius says, in times of war, then they have all but absolute power. Not absolute power, all but absolute power. In other words, tremendous power. But we'll see in a little bit that the President doesn't have every single element of power when it comes to war. Well, let's look at this. Now Polybius tells us a little bit about the Senate. The Senate has, first of all, the control of the Treasury, regulates the receipts and disbursements alike. In other words, Senate has control in terms of money coming into the government and money being spent by the government. Okay? Notice the consul doesn't have that power. This is a separate power that the Senate has. The Senate has the power to take money into the government and to spend money. Look at what the U.S. Constitution says. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, and then it says duties, imposts, excises, basically different ways that the government brings in money, and to pay the debts of the United States. Okay, so when it comes to the Treasury, when it comes to taxation, when it comes to spending, that's not the President's power. The President can say, I look for this kind of taxation. The President can say, I look for this kind of spending. But only the Congress has the power to do that, to actually do it. Very interesting. Remember we saw a minute ago that in the execution of war and the prosecution of war, the consul has all but supreme power, right? So there's a lot of power there, but not absolute power. Look at what it says, look at what Polybius says, that the power that the Senate has. If it is necessary to proclaim war, this too is the business of the Senate. So once war has been proclaimed, then the consuls have power. But who has the power to proclaim war? Only the Senate does. Now look at the U.S. Constitution. Congress shall have the power to declare war. So the U.S. President is Commander-in-Chief. Once war is underway, the U.S. President is Commander-in-Chief and wields tremendous power. But who has the power to declare war? Not the President. Congress has the power to declare war. There is an example of separation of powers. Okay, so we've related the consul to the U.S. President. We've related the Senate of the Roman Republic to the U.S. Senate. We haven't said anything at all about the U.S. House of Representatives, which is part of the legislative branch. And so is there any connection there? Let's look at what Polybius says about the people. So we've talked about consul power, the power of the consuls. We've talked about the power of the Senate. What about the power of the people? Here's what Polybius says. He says, after this, one would be naturally inclined to ask what part is left for the people in the Constitution. The Senate has a lot of power. The consuls have a lot of power. But he says near the bottom there, he says, but the people is, or the people are, the sole fountain of honor and of punishment. The kind of power that the people have is to send messages of approval and disapproval to those who have political power. And how might that happen? Well, one of the ways that might happen is through voting. Remember, we've talked a little bit about differences, or privileges that Roman citizens had. And one of the privileges Roman citizens had was to vote for political leaders. And of course, the same thing is true in the United States. And so consuls have tremendous power. Senators have tremendous power. But the people also have power. The people can vote, right? And they can, as Polybius says, to go back, that the people is the sole fountain of honor and of punishment. To vote for someone is to send that person a message of honor. I prefer you over the other candidate. To vote against someone is a kind of disapproval. It signals disapproval. It signals a kind of punishment. I don't like your ideas. I don't like your style. I'm voting for the other person. And that is power. And of course, every person who votes is exercising a kind of power. And how do we see this play out more in the U.S. Constitution? One of the things that's interesting is that not in the Senate, not in the presidency, but it's in the House of Representatives that we have these symbols of Roman power. And I think we've mentioned this before. These symbols of Roman power, these are the fasces, they're called, the fasces. These are symbols of power in ancient Rome, right? And these symbols of power are not in the Senate. They're in the House of Representatives, right? And so, the Constitution of the Roman Republic, the consul, that's like the president. The Senate, it's like the Senate. And people power, we see exercised, or we see at work in the idea of the House of Representatives, because for the writers of the U.S. Constitution, the idea was that we want one political body, we want one organization in the government to be really close to the people, right? The power of the Senate, that's going to be more distance from the people, right? The power of the president, that's going to be a bit more distance from the people. But we want one body within the government to be very close to the people. And it's that body that's closest to the people, that's where we're going to put these symbols, right? Now, the Constitution doesn't require these symbols to be in the House of Representatives. But when the Congress building is built, we want to indicate that of the political bodies, the one that is closest to the people, that's the one where the power resides. And so the idea of people power, right? People power is most expressed in the House of Representatives. How so? Let's look at it. So, for example, remember, we talked about the three branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. We haven't really said anything about the judicial branch here, okay? And remember, we said that in the legislative branch, there are two bodies within the legislative branch. One is the Senate and one is the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, just another example of separation of powers, the House and the Senate, even though they're both part of the legislative branch, they have different powers, all right? And one power that the House of Representatives has, which is distinct, which is unique to itself, is, as it says there, it might be a little hard to read because it's small, but it says that the House alone has the power to initiate all revenue bills, right? In other words, any bill that's going to tax the people, that bill can only start officially in the House of Representatives. Of course, presidents can talk about it, senators can talk about it, but legislation that will lead to taxation, that is, to the government, taking people's money to do things, that legislation can only begin in the House of Representatives, right? In other words, in the body that's closest to the people, right? The body that's most accountable to the people, because that's a lot of power. For the government to take people's money in the form of taxation, that's a lot of power. And so we want the body that has the power to do that to be the one that's closest to the people. Now, how is it closest to the people? Look down at the next thing where the arrow is. Members of the Senate are elected every 6 years, but members of the House are elected every 2 years. What does that mean? That means if I'm a senator and I have to make a decision that the people who voted for me probably won't like, but my next election is 4 years away, well then maybe I'm willing to do that because I think it's the right thing, even though a lot of people who voted for me won't like it. But I've got 4 years between now and the next election. So that gives me a cushion. I feel a little bit safe. But if I'm in the House of Representatives and I have to be reelected every 2 years, then that means I'm going to pay a lot of attention to what the people I represent really want, right? That those people that I'm asking to reelect me every 2 years, right, I'm going to be accountable to them. I'm going to be accountable to them, and that's where the writers of the Constitution put the power of taxation, first of all, in the House of Reps. Because that's a big deal for government to take people's money in the form of taxation. And so the writers of the U.S. Constitution wanted the people who had that power to be the most accountable to the people. So can you see that's a kind of people power, right? Because the people can say, well, I don't like the fact that you voted for that new tax, and so I'm going to vote you out, right? Now, of course, the House of Representatives alone doesn't pass tax law. The Senate has to agree, and then the President, is involved. But according to the Constitution, those laws have to begin in the House. And members of the House are elected every 2 years. The idea is that members of the House the idea is that because members of the House are elected every 2 years, then the idea is that they will be most attentive to the desires of the people, because they have to face the people for re-election every 2 years. Okay, so in the Roman Republic, we see the consul, who, for example, is commander-in-chief in the time of war. Same thing with the U.S. president. In the Roman Republic, we see the Senate has the power to declare war. And in the U.S. Constitution, Congress has the power to declare war, both the Senate and the House. We see that presidents have the power to nominate ambassadors, but only senators can decide whether they actually will be ambassadors or not. And then we see Polybius talking about the importance of people power, right? The people also need to have a kind of power. And the writers of the Constitution thought about that. And people can exercise their power by voting, and they can also have maybe a little extra power in this one body in Congress where the members of Congress have to come back every 2 years if they want to be reelected. And since they have to come every 2 years, they're more accountable to the people than maybe senators would be, who are elected every 6 years. So there are obviously, some pretty significant differences between the Constitution of the Roman Republic, as Polybius writes about it, and the U.S. Constitution as we have it today. But we can see some of the influence of the Roman Republic in the U.S. Constitution. That influence gets into the writing of Montesquieu. Montesquieu has a big influence on the writers of the U.S. Constitution. And so this part of the world that we're looking at here, its influence continues into the 21st century. It continues in our language, and as we've seen in a few ways, it has some influence in how the Constitution of the United States is set up.